What other TV shows have you represented over the years?
Well, as I say, the Get Smart show, McMillan and Wife show, he and she, uh, of course, Seinfeld show now I've represented for a long time. The Seinfeld show.
Do you represent the Seinfeld show or Jerry Seinfeld or both?
Jerry Seinfeld.
Okay. And you've had talking about Get Smart. I got to get back to music, but talking about Get Smart was is that how you met Mel Brooks?
No.
How did you meet Mel Brooks?
Actually, through Alan Schwartz. Alan Schwartz joined my firm, well, it was Cooper Epstein Hurwitz, and his longtime client was Mel Brooks. And then I started doing initially the music work for Mel Brooks.
What music work back in?
Well, Mel wrote all the songs for all the songs that were in his movies. And
like History of the World Part 1?
All that, and then he wrote all the music for the producers on Broadway.
Oh yeah, okay.
And Young Frankenstein on Broadway. And I represented him for that.
Well, when did you start? I want to get the time frame here. When did you start representing Mel Brooks?
I don't know. Sometime. I don't remember exactly. When Alan joined my firm, I would say Alan joined my firm probably sometime early 80s is my guess.
Okay.
That's a guess.
When you were a professional musician, you were basically, I guess you were not just doing music law. How did you get into representing a television production company?
Through music, actually, because I was representing a well-known producer, Bones Howe.
I know Bones. So what year was this?
It would be a guess. It probably started in the late 60s, early 70s. I don't know.
Only because at some point I want to kind of put a timeline together of all this stuff. That's why I'm going to keep asking you dates.
Anyway, I started representing Bones Howe.
He was a music producer.
Yes, a major music producer. And he's an engineer and producer. And then he formed a company with Steve Binder. That's where I met Steve Binder. Steve Binder was a major television producer, director. Steve Binder then went into Talent Associates, and then I started representing Talent Associates.
How did you, because I know how you kind of, when you started representing David Rose, you convinced him you knew copyright and you went and learned about it. And you said that when you were sitting in court representing the various band members that were getting in trouble, you were reading record contracts, you were reading and publishing contracts. So you were reading television contracts also?
Yeah.
Was that just for education at that stage?
No, because they were being hired to do something for them.
So who was the first one that hired you to do television production?
I don't know. I can't remember which was the first one.
Okay. Come back to that. Going back to just the music industry overall. So we talked about touring. When you said earlier that the economy also is different now than it was in 1953, how is the music economy different?
Yeah, the numbers got bigger.
Well, aside from just the numbers getting bigger,
that was it.
How is it? That's it. That's the sole
the numbers
difference?
getting bigger and making the economics change in the industry. So if somebody is assigned to a contract, a record contract, and they're getting X amount of royalties, and they're getting or the royalties turned into X amount of dollars, and now all of a sudden they're selling millions of records instead of thousands of records. They go back and we go back and renegotiate the contract and get more numbers and all that. And then the LPs. I do remember that LPs were selling more than LPs were selling more than single discs, and then when CDs came in the '80s, it started selling. Same product started selling for $5 more than the LPs.
The disc was selling for $5 more than the
CDs
vinyl.
We're selling for all of a sudden we're selling for about $5 more than vinyl, and so now the artists and the representatives say, "Wait a minute, we want a bigger piece of what is you're getting. We want a bigger piece of what you're receiving."
So, I mean, today still a lot. There's discussion, use of the 360 deal. I know that's still a thing. That was not the case in the 1950s, right?
Well, with the exception of some of the labels like Motown.
So, how did Motown do it?
Motown found these incredible people in Detroit and signed them overall for everything. They're touring, they're merchandising, they're songwriting, they're whatever, they're acting, everything. The Motown label, the Cap label, there were several labels out of Chicago. Cap was one of them, K-A-P-P. And they were doing 360s before the big companies were doing 360s.
It wasn't called 360s back then.
No, they weren't called. They were just called a slave contract. No, I don't know what the name was.
Did you represent any Motown artists?
I had an occasion. At one point, the answer is yes. Lionel Richie was a Motown artist.
But that came much
later.
Later. I mean, it also was after Motown's heyday, right? I mean, Motown's heyday was in the 60s, maybe?
Yeah.
And you represented Lionel Richie in the 80s, as I recall.
I can't remember exactly.
What was the thing that we
You're not asking the question, he's asking the question.
Sorry.
What was your question?
Yeah, what was your question?
No, when we met, it was backstage at the Greek Theater. What was the
1966.
So, what were back then? That's another thing that the industry's changed quite a bit, though, right? There are now basically 3 majors, and the rest are just minors, I guess.
Well, not some of the minors are not so minor.
Some of them are huge, but it's still Sony, Warner, and Universal in today's day. How did it consolidate like that? I mean, in the 1950s, clearly that wasn't the case. So what led to the consolidation ultimately into 3 companies?
Painful story. Because they started buying up labels. Universal wound up buying Geffen Records. They wound up buying A&M Records. They wound up buying Motown Records. Sony was really Columbia Records. Columbia bought some, and then when Sony took over, they started buying labels, and Warner started buying. There was Atlantic Records, and that was then bought by Warner's at some point, Warner Brothers, the publishing, bought Chappell Music, so it became Warner Chappell. All these companies, they started acquiring all these other companies.
So, I mean, that's what happened. But as we're talking about the change in the music industry since the early 1950s, and we're talking about the economy, what do you think led to that consolidation other than they just started buying them? Was there something with the music economy that caused them to start
They saw the opportunity. They saw the business growing, and they saw these individual labels, and they said, wow, look at A&M Records, Herbie Alpert and Jerry Moss. What a terrific operation that is. Let's get that. Let's go buy that. The same thing that happens in general industries. Companies buy companies, right, to expand their reach.
Yes, they do.
And one of the great lines when I was up in Sacramento, the RIA was trying to get We have a law in California, a 7-year statute, which means you can't employ anybody in any job more than 7 continuous years. The RIAA, Record Industry Association of America, came into California and said, we got to change that for the record industry. We don't want to have an artist leave us after 7 years, even though every other employee, including in motion picture company, because there was a case here called Olivia de Havilland versus, I think, Warner's. I'm not positive of that. Anyway, the court said 7 years means 7 years. Even if you put her on suspension, 7 years is 7 years. And she's entitled to, at the end, to leave. And so the record company said, oh, we don't like that. So they came in. I was on the opposite end of this thing, fighting and saying, we have to change the law for a record artist.
And what year are we talking about?
I don't remember. It's easy to look up. I don't know. Sometime in the 90s, early 90s.
Early 90s, okay.
We have to change it for record artists. And so they got a law passed that said at the end of 7 years, if the artist hasn't delivered all of the albums, even if they're only option albums that the record company hasn't exercised, they can be held liable for damages. Damages based on sales of their previous albums and things like that. It's an abomination.
So wait, who could be liable? The artist?
Yes.
Okay, if they leave.
If they leave.
All right, go ahead.
So they can be sued for damages. It's an abomination. Irving Azoff tried to do it again. He was involved with me in this. So one of the things that happened at the hearing that I was at in Sacramento, we brought, what's her name, Courtney Love? Courtney Love, right?
Courtney Love, yes. Kurt Cobain's wife, ex-wife?
Yeah, that's the one. She was one that came up to testify, and what she said was why she thought this was unfair. She says, when I was a young artist, David Geffen wanted me to sign with David Geffen, with Geffen Records. And he said, I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to do that for you, I'm going to do this for you, et cetera, et cetera. And so I signed with that label. And then David Geffen's, he sold that to MCA. MCA then sold my contract to a Japanese company. Japanese company then sold it to a whiskey company in Canada. Whiskey company in Canada then sold it to a waste disposal company in France called it was Universal. And so instead of me calling David Geffen when there's a problem, who do I call at the waste disposal company when I have a problem? It was powerful testimony. They promptly ignored her.
Well, help me understand that you said they ignored her, but ultimately, isn't that the law today? Is that still it's a maximum of 7 years?
No, not for record artists.
And is that why, like in the record agreements, they talk about the deal? It goes from delivery, and sometimes the delivery can take 16 months, and then if you have 7 albums plus an extra 4 months every year, that contract lasts 9 years, 10 years
at least.
And tell me, who were you representing in that?
SAG-AFTRA.
Oh, you were representing SAG-AFTRA. And
SAG and AFTRA weren't together at that time. So I was representing SAG and AFTRA.
And that's not a conflict of interest, I guess. They were completely aligned on that. Yeah. And they were trying to. What was the nature of this hearing? I mean, was it?
The nature of the hearing was simply that the record companies wanted to eliminate the 7-year statute as far as it applies.
Oh, so that's how it happened. Okay, so the 7-year statute was in place, and the RIAA went and lobbied against it. SAG, AFTRA, probably others, obviously were seeking to preserve the law, and ultimately the decision was
that as far as musicians are concerned, it doesn't apply.
What about actors?
What about what?
Actors.
Yeah, of course it applies to actors. It applies to everybody in California. It applies to if you're a sewer worker or a major star.
So How is it that the RIAA managed to get that exception and film and television haven't done that?
Ask the state legislature in California.
It's a little tough.
They just did it. They just did it.
Well, when did that happen?
Sometime, I think, early 90s. Sometime.
Yeah, so that's 30 years ago at this point.
Yeah. And Irving Azoff and Don Henley were part of the group that I went up with. I was representing what's called the Recording Artists Coalition, which is an organization started because of a copyright issue, started by Don Henley and Sheryl Crow, and I was representing him. And that's another whole issue about the work for hire issue. That's where it started, and then that morphed into this issue because then we were fighting the RIA on the work for hire issue, and then we got into this 7-year statute issue. It was simply using their clout and their political power to change the law for artists.
You mentioned, because I remember when you testified with Sheryl Crow and Don Henley, did you do that only in the state of California, or did you did that in Washington, D.C., and you testified before Congress with them also?
Yes.
Was that the same issue? But, I'm sorry, was the same RIAA was the opponent, but you were there on the work for hire issue?
Right.
No. So how did that come about?
How did what come about?
Well, you were asked to go to Washington, D.C. to testify.
What happened?
What was the specific issue?
Specific issue is the RIA work for hire says you cannot terminate a work for hire contract. There's the law that says you can terminate after 35. After 35 years, after 56 years, et cetera, et cetera. You can get your notwithstanding the fact that you've assigned your copyright, you can get it back 35 years later under the new law. So the RIAA, but the law says it has to be if it's a work for hire, you cannot terminate. And a work for hire has to be in writing, it has to say it's a work for hire, and it has to be one of 9 categories. Audiovisual works are one of 9 categories.
Atlas, among other weird things.
So,
go ahead.
So the RIA in the end of the year, I think it was 1999 or 1999, went in to the congressional committee that usually held the hearings on copyright, and they said, "Oh, by the way, there's a technical error. You didn't include sound recordings as a 10th category." And so, sorry about that. And so they corrected it and passed a law. They added the provision to a 1,000-page, 1,000-page long I can't remember, on television or something of that nature. They added this 10th category, sound recordings. It was brought to my attention by either Don Henley or Sheryl Crow or somebody. And I said, wait a minute, we got to do something about this. That's not right. That's not right. There were no hearings on this. This is a substantial issue. So I wrote a letter to Congress, and it turns out that they got embarrassed, and then Howard Berman, who was the minority leader, and Howard Coble, who was the majority leader of that particular committee, the Copyright Committee, said, we better hold hearings. So I was invited to come to testify. I got Sheryl to come and testify. We had dueling professors. By the way, the professor on our side was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's daughter, a professor in New York. And they had a professor. We had Mike Green testifying from the recording Grammys, and Hillary Rosen, who was then the head of the RIA, testified. it turned out that during the hearing, and Kerry Sherman, who was the general counsel at that time Kerry Sherman, the general counsel of RA at that time, was there and testified, and it became apparent to Coble and to Howard Berman that they fucked up. Okay, they shouldn't have added this thing without having a hearing or something like that. So they called a halt to the hearing, called me and Kerry Sherman into a room and said, we think it would be advisable if the two of you were to sit down and work out language to repeal this provision. So he and I sat in a room for hours, and we said, well, we're close, but we're not finished. They said, okay, go back home, but we wanted by such and such a date a repeal of this thing. So we worked out the repeal language and got it back to the Congressional Committee, and they passed it. They passed a law repealing the 10th category.
And the 10th category was sound recording.
Sound recording. However, what's happened, and by the way, they were very kind to me because they put me into the congressional record. They gave me a thank you in the congressional record. So what their position is today is, okay, so, but it's one of the other categories of sound recordings. It's a collective work or I forget the other category. There's two categories they jump on. It's a work made for hire because it fits within a collective work. A collective work is one of them, yeah.
Yeah, I think I've seen that. Basically, it's a collective work because there's multiple songs.
There's two different categories that they jump on. I can't remember what the second one is at the moment.
So ultimately, you got the addition of the sound recording repealed, but they still use it anyway to call it a work for hire for a sound recording because it's a collective work.
Well, there's lawsuits going on about it right now. There's a couple of class action lawsuits going.
Present day. And who's initiated those?
I don't remember.
You're not involved.
I'm not involved.
You had mentioned, well, you were there. I'm sorry. On whose behalf in that particular? Was it SAG-AFTRA again? Or
No, I was there because I formed this organization with Cheryl and Don Henley and Irving Azoff called Recording Artists Coalition.
Okay,
and
they
they
formed it for that purpose?
For that purpose, and then they went out and got a lot of artists to sign on to it, and then they were doing concerts and raising money to pay for it.
Who ultimately, because that's interesting, who became part of the Recording Artists Coalition?
Oh, the whole list of artists. I don't remember what they all are.
I'm going to look that up. Hang on a minute.
Eventually, then the second thing we did was to fight the 7-year statute in California.
So that happened after.
That happened afterwards, and then we weren't doing anything, and eventually it was merged into the Recording Academy, and they never touched it. They never did anything with it.
You have largely spent your career
working.
Yes, you have. Advocating on behalf of artists.
Correct.
And is that by design as opposed to, and here's what I'm asking, because you've always joked that when you started, and I mentioned this previously, that when you started practicing law, you practiced door law.
Correct. And
anything that came into the door, you would take it.
Right.
And other types of clients, record labels, for example, could have come through your door. Publishers could have come through your door, and I know you've represented publishers, but did you make a conscious decision that I want to advocate for recording artists and songwriters?
Yes.
And at what point in time did that happen?
I did represent some labels, smaller labels. I represented an important German label called ECM Records. I have represented very small labels over the years, but never the majors. We made a conscious decision, even at this firm, never not to represent the majors.
By this firm, you mean Greenberg Traurig? But the what went into your decision, or what compelled you, or what motivated you to make a conscious decision that I only want to advocate for artists and songwriters?
Because that's always been my thing. I was an artist, and I believe in artists' rights, and I saw the damage that labels and publishing companies did to artists over the years. I saw it.
What was the most significant or impactful thing that you had ever seen done to, on both sides, to negatively affect artists and positively affect artists in the last 7 years?
For instance, Etta James, all those records that she had, and all those hits that she had, she was on Cap Records, never received any royalties.
And what years was she there? And did you, that you're saying that's the worst thing? Did you get her royalties eventually?
Yeah.
So tell me about that, because I was going to ask about the representation of her anyway.
The answer is yes and no. In that particular case, she got on. I can't remember the timing, but when Cap Records, which I had nothing to do with, Cap Records sold to Universal, and I call it Universal, then started paying her royalties.
So what year about, just
I
again,
don't know.
no, did you represent Etta James?
For a long time, and I don't remember the years.
50s? 60s?
No. Probably later than that. Till she died. I represented her probably 20 years till she died.
Okay. So
did you know who Etta James's father was?
Mr. James?
No. Minnesota Fats.
No, that's pretty wild. I did not know that. Okay. Did you ever meet Minnesota Fats?
No.
But going back to the question, the worst thing that you've ever seen in the last 70 years as to what was done to an artist was she never got paid any royalties for.
She never got paid her royalties.
But you did manage to correct that.
Yes.
You said. And how did you do that?
Well, it was with. In this particular case, I have to say it was with Universal, but Universal stepped up without me talking to them. We improved the contract at Universal, but they started paying her royalties before I did.
So I'll keep it in that context for a minute. Like, what though is, in terms of your artists, since we're talking about Etta James, because I want to talk more globally about the industry general, but what, as far as your artists are concerned, was the most significant thing to happen to an artist in a positive way?
Well, we have not me alone, but we have improved the royalty structure that artists get. We have improved the contract terms over the years.
I was going to ask about that. Okay.
And we've lessened the horrendous album signings, like what Mike Curb signed. I forget who was that young girl that he signed. She was about 16 years old for a 22 album deal.
Who was that?
Oh, he had a major woman on his label. Now, she was a kid at the time he signed her, but it was a 22 album deal. And what we've contributed myself, but not alone, with other attorneys too. I mean, lessened the commitment down from 10 albums, 12 albums, or whatever it was, down to 7 albums, 8 albums, 6 albums, 5 albums, 4 albums, whatever it is, and better the royalty terms and all around, and worked on ways to get them out of the contracts in certain instances. Generally improved the terms. It wasn't me alone. It was a whole bunch of attorneys who woke up to this fact and did the job. Don Passman did a great job. Others have done a good job.
All right. Well, we're running out of time for today, so let me ask this question. The Recording Academy. When did your involvement with the Recording Academy begin?
I remember when I joined fairly early on. I joined the local chapter. here, and then Lee Young, no, not Lee Young. I can't remember what. Lee Young was an attorney. His father was a drummer, by the way, and was a drummer, and his father's brother was Lester Young, the great jazz tenor saxophone player. I became friends with the father in the Recording Academy when I joined, and then I was asked to run for the board. I ran for the board. I got elected on the board.
Do you remember approximate year?
No. And then...
You remember approximate decade?
My guess, 60s to 70s.
All right, so you ran for the board.
I ran for the board, got elected to the board, and then somebody on the board suggested that I run for president of the chapter, and I did, and I won. And then I was a national. I ran for national trustee. I was a national trustee, and then somebody there, I'll have to think of who it was, suggested I run for the national president.
Which you did, and you won that too.
Right.
My father, the politician. What year was that? Were you president? Because I remember.
I don't know. It's easy to find out. I don't know.
I do remember. You did some television appearance. You spoke at the Grammy Awards, and that was televised.
Twice.
Twice. And so, did you serve as president for 2 years?
2 years. That was the maximum anybody could serve.
And what, in your opinion, was the most significant change brought about during your reign as national president of the Recording Academy?
I don't know.
Well, I mean, what did you do? What did you fight for? What was your purpose? I mean, what did you accomplish?
We went to dinner. We had nice dinner. I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I don't know.
All right. Well, then we'll pick up from there. I want to get back to the change in the music industry. I want to get some more insight on that mainly because you've seen more than anybody, I think. And I don't mean just because of, you've been doing it so long, but you've been intricately involved in it. You've seen the evolution of the music industry. So that's what I'd like to talk about, and I'd like to talk about your time at the Recording Academy. And then I think, of course, I want to talk about USA for Africa next time as well. I got a few subjects that I'm going to want to hit. And I do note that I have the notepad here for Four Seasons. Is this the Four Seasons Garden and Landscaping Four Seasons?
No, not that one.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm gonna conclude here for now. That ends session number 2.
we met.
What's that?
I said, huh?
We didn't mean it the Four Seasons.
No.
All right. I'm shutting this one to end number 2. And muchas gracias to the Papa.
Okay.
Okay, we are back on.
I've always stressed to attorneys, young attorneys, relationships is the key to everything over the years. Relationship. And a perfect example happened the other day when one of the associates working for me we are trying to settle a matter with Universal, and she's not getting any answers. She's not getting any answers from the people she's dealing with. Not getting any answers. Not getting it for months going on. I said, okay, let's call. I can't think of his name. He's the head of legal. McMullen. McMullen over there. I called the head of legal with her on the phone, and I said, Alex, we're having this problem here. I can't reach this person. I'll take care of it. And 10 minutes later, the person she couldn't reach called her and solved the problem. Relationships.
Got it. Okay, that's good. I'm concerned of what I did here, so hang on a minute.